They told me to wait in the airport lounge. They said, "Just relax, Mom. We'll come back for you." I waited 8 hours. They never came. I was 77 years old, and my son had just abandoned me to catch a flight to paradise. But they made one mistake. They left me with my own credit card and a lifetime of secrets. They told me to wait in the airport lounge. My son, Adam, used that clipped, overly patient voice, the one he reserved for the confused and the inconvenient. "Just relax, Mom," he'd said. "We'll come back for you." I nodded, of course. I sat where he told me, next to a dusty, potted ficus, a piece of forgotten furniture between a crying toddler and a flickering television tuned to a silent weather channel. I was 77 years old, and I was on my way to Honolulu for a grand family vacation. Or so I believed. The trip was Lisa's idea. My daughter-in-law had orchestrated everything with the meticulous, iron-willed cheerfulness she applied to all family functions. 3 days before, I'd laid out every outfit on my bed, just as I used to for Adam's school trips. Lisa had insisted on matching t-shirts for me and the grandchildren. Mine, in a shade of bubblegum pink that did me no favors, read "Vacation Nana" in glittering letters. I disliked it intensely, but I wore it. To refuse would have meant a lecture on being a team player. A small thing, I told myself. It's always a small thing, until it isn't. The small cuts had started at the airport check-in. Lisa had rolled her eyes when I brought my own snacks, a small bag of almonds and an apple. "Mom, they have food on the plane," she'd sighed, as if I were a child who didn't understand commerce. At the security line, things started to feel wrong. A cold knot began to form in my stomach. Lisa kept glancing at her watch. Adam was unusually quiet, his jaw tight. The grandchildren, absorbed in their phones, were islands of digital indifference. When the TSA agent asked about our seating arrangements, Lisa had laughed, a brittle sound. "Oh, we'll sort all that out later." It was the last time anyone looked me directly in the eye. Once we were through security, the performance reached its conclusion. Lisa turned to me with that same fixed smile, the one that never reached her eyes. "Mom, why don't you wait for us in the lounge? We'll go ahead, check the bags, sort out the kids' boarding passes, and then come get you. Just relax. You've done enough." She patted my arm. The touch wasn't affection. It was a dismissal, a gentle, polite shove out of their way. So I sat. I became invisible in my own life, a thing that happened not all at once, but gradually, like a photograph fading in the sun. I watched them walk away, a tight, self-contained unit, and disappear into the bustling crowd. They were a family, and I, it seemed, was merely a relative. The dusty plant beside me felt like a companion, another living thing left to wilt in a place of transit. They said they would come back. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to understand a terrible truth. Sometimes, the deepest wounds aren't inflicted with a shout, but with a quiet, deliberate act of forgetting. They didn't just leave me behind. They parked me like a car they no longer needed, assuming I would simply wait, inert and uncomplaining, until they were ready to remember me again. They were wrong. The first hour passed in a state of nervous expectation. I told myself they were caught in a long line, that the children are being difficult. It was easy to believe in a simple mistake. It was what I had been trained to do my entire life, assume the best of them, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. After an hour, I stood up and paced near the window, my hands clasped behind my back. After 2, I asked the front desk to page Adam. The announcement echoed through the terminal, my son's name called into the void. There was no response. My hope began to feel thin, stretched, like old elastic. By the 4th hour, I stopped looking toward the entrance. A cold certainty had begun to settle in my bones. I watched other families, grandmothers holding hands with small children, fathers laughing with their sons, mothers adjusting their daughters' hair. They moved in a painful ballet of connection, a world I was no longer a part of. The woman sitting across from me had lunch, made 2 phone calls, gathered her things, and left for her flight. People around me came and went. The announcements for departures to Chicago, Dallas, and Denver became a kind of mocking chorus. The world moved on, but I remained fixed in time, a living monument to a promise they never intended to keep. This wasn't carelessness. I knew my son. Adam was a lot of things: ambitious, demanding, often thoughtless, but he was not careless. Carelessness implies a lack of thought. This required thought. This was an abandonment, planned with the same cool precision he applied to his business dealings, a logistical problem solved by removing the inconvenient piece: me. It wasn't until 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 8 hours after I'd been told to wait, that I finally approached the airline service desk. The young woman behind the counter had kind eyes. I gave her Adam's full name. She typed for a moment, then hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She glanced at me, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to careful pity. "Ma'am," she began slowly, "Adam Harlow and his family checked into the 1:45 p.m. flight to Honolulu. It's already departed." I nodded, my head feeling strangely heavy. I asked her to repeat it. She did, her voice softer this time, as if delivering a diagnosis. Her kindness was a strange comfort, a small point of light in the vast gathering darkness. So that was it. They had boarded without me. Not by accident, not by some tragic misunderstanding. They had simply gone. The string I'd kept taut inside me for so many years, the one that held together the fragile idea of our family, didn't just fray. It snapped. I walked to the nearest restroom, the one by the sea gates. I locked myself in a stall and sat down on the closed toilet lid, not to cry, but to think. The shock was too deep for tears, the betrayal too clinical. Crying felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. It was in that quiet, undignified place, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and the murmur of strangers, that something inside me shifted. It wasn't a snap. It was slower, colder. For the first time in decades, I felt something calcify inside me, a hardening where softness had always lived. For 50 years, I had been the family's shock absorber. I had swallowed small slights at Thanksgiving dinners, mediated arguments between Adam and his father, and made myself smaller to fit into the shrinking spaces they allotted for me. My role was to be accommodating, to be the quiet, stable bedrock upon which they built their own, more important lives. And in that moment, in that sterile bathroom stall, I understood that the bedrock had finally cracked. The woman who would have forgiven them anything, who would have made excuses for their cruelty, had been left behind in that lounge chair. She was gone. I emerged from the restroom as the airport was shifting into its evening rhythm. The frantic buzz of the day had dimmed to a weary hum. I walked to the main departure screen, a vast wall of flickering cities and times. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a strange and terrifying calm. I looked at the list of destinations, not as a stranded woman, but as a free agent, scanning a menu of possibilities. I wasn't just left behind, I had been released. The game they had been playing, where I was a pawn to be moved and managed, was over, because I was no longer playing by their rules. In fact, I was about to start a new game entirely, and they had no idea they were already several moves behind. My eyes scanned the departure board, past the predictable destinations of sun and sand. Then I saw it. Portland, 7:35 p.m. I don't know why I chose it. Maybe because it was a city I hadn't seen in decades. Maybe because it was where I'd once learned to ride a bicycle, a memory of a girl who was fearless and free. Or maybe, simply, because it was the furthest thing from the tropical paradise they had chosen over me. The decision felt less like a choice and more like a magnet pulling a forgotten piece of metal home. I walked to the ticket counter, my steps steady and deliberate. A young woman with tired eyes looked up. "One ticket to Portland, please," I said. My voice was even, betraying nothing of the tectonic shift happening inside me. "Tonight?" she asked, hesitating. "Yes." "Round trip?" "No," I said, the word a small, sharp declaration of independence. just one way. I slid my own credit card across the counter. Not the joint account Adam monitored, but my own. The one I'd kept open since before his wedding, funded by the small inheritance my mother had left me, a secret seed of autonomy I'd nurtured in the dark for years. I had just enough for the fare, a cheap motel, and maybe a start. I didn't need more. Before heading to the new gate, I stopped at a restroom. I took off the ridiculous pink Vacation Nana t-shirt and stuffed it deep into the trash bin, burying the caricature they had tried to make of me. Then, I took out my phone and held the power button down until the screen went black. No frantic messages, no missed calls. Of course not. They were already in the air, sipping complimentary drinks, their problem neatly solved. The boarding process was quiet. No one asked why a 77-year-old woman was traveling alone at night. No one looked at me twice. I was anonymous, and for the first time in years, it felt like a superpower. On the plane, I took a window seat and watched the lights of Wilmington fall away beneath me. The city looked like a spill of scattered jewels, beautiful and distant. 8 hours ago, I thought I was going to paradise. Turns out, I was just being left behind. But as the plane banked west, I realized they had made a grave miscalculation. They thought they were leaving me in a waiting room, but they had actually shown me the door. And now, I was walking through it, to somewhere real, somewhere they couldn't follow. I landed in Portland just after 10 o'clock at night. The air that greeted me outside the terminal was damp and sharp. Rain had fallen recently, and it smelled of wet concrete and pine, a clean, honest scent that washed away the artificial sweetness of my family's lies. The airport was quieter than I remembered from my last visit, decades ago. Or maybe it was me who had shrunk, folded inward from the weight of a day like no other. I walked slowly through the terminal, not because of my age, but because I no longer felt the need to rush. No one was waiting for me. And for the first time in years, that silence didn't feel like something missing. It felt like peace. I found a bench under an awning and sat down with my carry-on, the same one Adam had mocked for being too old-fashioned. It was brown leather, worn at the corners, a gift from my late husband Derek for our 25th anniversary. He would have laughed at what happened today, a deep, knowing laugh that said, "Well, sweetheart, what did you expect?" I didn't expect this, not really, but I also wasn't surprised. Some people mistake kindness for weakness until they discover too late what strength truly looks like. I landed in Portland just after 10 o'clock at night. The air that greeted me outside the terminal was damp and sharp. Rain had fallen recently, and it smelled of wet concrete and pine, a clean, honest scent that washed away the artificial sweetness of my family's lies. The airport was quieter than I remembered from my last visit, decades ago. Or maybe it was me who had shrunk, folded inward from the weight of a day like no other. I walked slowly through the terminal, not because of my age, but because I no longer felt the need to rush. No one was waiting for me. And for the first time in years, that silence didn't feel like something missing. It felt like peace. I found a bench under an awning and sat down with my carry-on, the same one Adam had mocked for being too old-fashioned. It was brown leather, worn at the corners, a gift from my late husband Derek for our 25th anniversary. He would have laughed at what happened today, a deep, knowing laugh that said, "Well, sweetheart, what did you expect?" I didn't expect this, not really, but I also wasn't surprised. Some people mistake kindness for weakness until they discover too late what strength truly looks like. I opened my wallet. 2 cards, 1 ID, $76 in cash, and a folded, yellowed piece of paper with an address I hadn't used in 50 years, 1849 Quinn Street. It was the address of my first apartment after marrying Derek. I didn't know if the building still existed or why I had tucked that piece of paper into my wallet before leaving home. But there it was, a relic of a past self, a woman who existed before she was subsumed by the titles of wife and mother. I didn't go there, not yet. I called a cab and gave the quiet driver the address of a cheap motel I had looked up online at the Wilmington airport, just in case. Room 207. The hallway smelled of cleaning fluid and tired stories. Inside, the room was small but clean. One bed, one chair, a television bolted to the wall. It was an anonymous space for a woman who had just become an anonymous person. I washed my face in the sink and lay down on the bed fully clothed, the blanket scratchy against my arms. I slept without dreams, for the first time in a long time. I wasn't waiting for a vacation to begin. A new life already had. The next morning, I stood at the motel window watching a woman in a pink robe walk her dog. She looked to be about my age, though perhaps a little stronger in the back. I made coffee in the small machine on the nightstand and sat in the stiff chair by the window, sipping slowly. My phone remained off. The absence of its buzzing, of the constant low-grade hum of other people's needs, was a palpable presence in the room. I had nowhere to be. It was a strange and startling realization. For decades, my time had belonged to others, to Adam, to Derek, to the grandchildren, even to the long-forgotten PTA meetings I'd stopped attending 20 years ago. But now, my time was mine again. It felt vast, empty, and full of terrifying possibility. At 9 o'clock, I left the motel and began to walk. My legs ached, and my hip registered a low murmur of complaint, but I kept going. I stopped at a corner bakery and bought a scone. The woman behind the counter smiled as I handed her exact change. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, her voice warm. "I used to be," I said, "a long time ago." "Well," she said, bagging the scone, "welcome back." I didn't know if I was back. I wasn't even sure I belonged anywhere anymore. But her words felt like a small, warm stone in my pocket. I asked her where I could find housing listings, and she pointed to a corkboard by the door, cluttered with the small-scale commerce of a neighborhood. Dog walking, used bicycles, music lessons. And then one note caught my eye, written in a blocky, no-nonsense hand. Room for rent, for quiet lady. Private room, shared kitchen, house safe, near bus, no nonsense, no drama, $400 a month. Call Joyce. The handwriting belonged to someone who meant what she said. I took a photo of the number with my dormant phone. By noon, I'd walked 2 more blocks and found a park bench warmed by the sun. I felt a strange urge, a sense of momentum I hadn't felt in years. I turned on the phone, ignored the inevitable notifications that would flood the screen, and dialed the number. The voice that answered was raspy, skeptical. "Yes?" "I'm calling about the room for rent," I said. A long pause. "How old are you?" 77. "Are you clean?" "Yes." "No boyfriends, right?" I chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "Not in a very long time." "Well," the voice rasped, "come by at 4, 2185 East Stafford. Bring cash for the first week." Then she hung up. I wrote the address on a napkin. It wasn't a job interview or a family dinner, it was a transaction. Simple, clear, and blessedly free of emotional baggage. It was exactly what I needed. At 4 o'clock, I stood in front of a faded blue house with a peeling porch and a wind chime that sounded like someone idly tapping spoons together. A woman opened the door with a cigarette in one hand and a marmalade cat curled around her ankles. She looked me up and down, her gaze sharp and unapologetic. This was Joyce. "You're the old lady?" she asked, her voice as raspy as it was on the phone. "I suppose I am," I said. She stepped aside. "Come in then. Let's see if we can tolerate each other." Joyce's house smelled of lavender and fried onions. It wasn't an unpleasant smell, just a real one. It was the smell of a woman who cooked actual meals and didn't fuss over the occasional grease stain. She led me through a narrow hallway stacked high with books and magazines into a small sitting room where a television was on mute. A crocheted blanket lay folded on the arm of the sofa. There was a comfortable clutter to the place, a sense that every object had a story. "The room's upstairs," she said, gesturing with her cigarette. I followed her up the creaky stairs, one hand on the banister. She opened a door at the end of the hall. "This is it." It was small, a twin bed, a nightstand, a dresser that had seen better decades. But the window was wide, and the afternoon sun poured in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. There was even a little desk with a worn wooden chair. It was more than a room. It was a sanctuary. It's fine, I said. $400 a month, but I take it weekly. $100 a week. Cash. No checks, no credit, no sob stories. She looked me over again, a shrewd assessment. You don't seem like the sob story type. No, I said, feeling the truth of it in my bones. Not anymore. She nodded once, as if that were the correct password. Kitchens shared, bathrooms down the hall. No guests without warning. I like quiet. You cause trouble, you're out. We clear? Crystal. She handed me a key. I handed her 5 $20 bills from the envelope I'd tucked into my inner coat pocket. She folded the bills without counting them and slipped them into the pocket of her housecoat. You hungry? She asked. I could eat. Joyce made grilled cheese sandwiches on thick bread and poured tomato soup from a saucepan. We ate at the small kitchen table under a yellowed ceiling fan. She didn't ask questions, which was a relief. People always ask too soon, before you're ready to say the truth out loud. As we finished, she only said, I hate eating alone. And I understood that well enough. I had been eating alone in a crowded house for years. This felt different. This felt like a beginning. After unpacking the few things I'd brought, 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, my medications, and an old paperback novel, I felt a new kind of emptiness. It wasn't loneliness. It was a lack of purpose. For the first time in 50 years, no one needed me to do anything. The next morning, as I walked the neighborhood, I saw a small chalkboard sign propped outside a corner cafe. Help wanted. Morning shift. Apply inside. I stood there for a long moment. I hadn't worked a paying job in decades, but I was no stranger to early hours and coffee pots. I pushed open the door. The place was simple. 3 booths, a counter, and a few bar stools with craft red cushions. A young woman in an apron was wiping the counter. You hiring? I asked. She looked up, surprised. You want to apply? Yes. She called to the back, and a stocky woman with her hair in a messy bun emerged. Her name tag read Heather. Her gaze was as direct and unsentimental as Joyce's. You have experience? She asked. I thought of the thousands of meals cooked, the school lunches packed, the fever soothed, the budgets managed. I thought of a lifetime of unpaid, invisible labor. I've raised 3 kids and run a household for 50 years, I said, my voice steady. I can make coffee, carry plates, and I don't call in sick. Heather stared at me for a beat, a flicker of something, amusement, respect, in her eyes. Then she shrugged. Trial shift tomorrow, 6 to 11. You make it through that, we'll talk. That night, I ironed the only blouse I owned that still held a sharp crease. I went to bed early and stared at the ceiling for a long time. It had been less than a week since the airport, less than a week since I had been discarded like an old book. But something had shifted inside me. I was no longer waiting for someone to find me. I was no longer a person to whom things happened. I was walking, I was working, I was beginning. This quiet, new, unexpected life was mine, and no one needed to know about it. Not yet. This was for me. The cafe smelled of burnt toast and old hope. I arrived at 5:45, 15 minutes early. Heather handed me an apron without ceremony. Keep your hair tied back, no perfume, refill cups without being asked, and if someone leaves less than $1 tip, that's on you, not them. I nodded, understood. She looked at me for a moment, then softened just a little. You nervous? No, I said, and it was the truth. I'm 77. I've buried a husband, raised a son who forgot my birthday 3 years in a row, and survived 5 colonoscopies. This is just coffee. Heather snorted, a sound like a surprised piglet. Fair enough. By 7 o'clock, the first wave of regulars came in. Contractors with paint on their boots, nurses fresh off the night shift, early risers who needed caffeine to face the day. I moved slowly but steadily. I remembered orders, poured coffee with a steady hand, and smiled without overdoing it. I found a rhythm in the chaos, a strange comfort in the simple, repetitive tasks. One of the regulars, a man with a kind face and a friendly smile, asked, "Where'd they dig you up?" I smiled back. Same place they find everything worth keeping, I said, wiping down the counter. The back shelf, under a blanket. He laughed and left a $5 tip. Heather watched from behind the register. She didn't say much, just nodded once after the breakfast rush died down. At 11, my shift was over. She poured 2 cups of coffee and pointed to the stool next to her. You did fine, she said. You're hired. Minimum wage plus tips. Weekday mornings. That enough for you? It's more than enough, I said. I walked back to Joyce's house with sore feet and a strange sense of lightness. At the end of the week, Heather handed me a thin envelope, my first paycheck, $74.26 after taxes. I wasn't used to carrying money that was purely mine. For years, every dollar I had was considered family money, to be used for groceries for Adam's family, birthday gifts that were never acknowledged, co-pays for appointments no one bothered to drive me to. But this was different. This I had earned. This was the currency of self-respect. It was mine and mine alone. I cashed the check at the bank on 3rd Street. I asked the young teller for 10s and 5s and 1s for the rest. She looked at me as if she wasn't sure I understood what I was doing. When she handed me the crisp bills, I folded them neatly and tucked them into my wallet. I walked out of that bank with my chin a little higher. Across the street was a second-hand clothing shop. Nothing fancy, just a narrow storefront with a cluttered window display and a small handwritten sign. Fall specials, 20% off coats. I stepped inside. The bell on the door tinkled softly. A girl who looked barely out of high school glanced up from behind the counter and gave me a genuine smile. Looking for something in particular? She asked. Yes, I said, the words surprising me as they came out. Something that makes me feel like myself again. She didn't laugh. She just nodded and gestured toward the racks. I ran my hand along the fabrics, bypassing the flimsy and the fashionable. I chose a navy wool coat with a subtle herringbone pattern and deep, practical pockets. It wasn't new, but it was warm and solid and well-made. I tried it on. It fit like it had been waiting for me. When I paid in cash, using the small bills I had just received, the girl wrapped it in tissue paper as if it were a precious gift. You look sharp, she said as she handed it to me. Thank you, I replied. I feel sharp. That evening, I walked home in that coat, even though it was just cool enough to justify it. Joyce was on the porch with her cat, Franklin, sipping wine from a coffee mug. Where you been? She asked. I bought a coat. She whistled, a low, appreciative sound. Look at you, classy lady. Only on Fridays, I said. Later, I stood in front of the small mirror in my room, turning left, then right. I ran my hand along the wool. It wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was armor. It was proof. I was still here, still standing, still capable of choosing something for myself. For the first time in a very long time, no one else had a say. My phone was still off. I hadn't turned it on since I landed in Portland. I didn't miss the calls because I knew there wouldn't be any. I missed people sometimes, but not the kind of people who leave you by a fake ficus plant at an airport and never look back. I had settled into a rhythm. Monday to Friday, I worked mornings at the cafe. On Saturdays, I took long walks through unfamiliar neighborhoods, discovering hidden parks and quiet streets. On Sundays, I rested. Joyce didn't hover. She didn't ask where I was going or why I was late. She'd just grunt when I came in and sometimes pour me a glass of wine from a box. It was a life built on small, quiet routines, and it was beginning to feel solid. Then, one evening, she came home with a stack of mail and tossed an envelope onto the kitchen table. "Something for you," she said. It had no return address, just my name written in a familiar looping script. I stared at it for a long moment before my hands would obey and open it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. "Grandma," it read, "where are you?" I didn't need to see the signature. I knew the handwriting. It belonged to Kieran, my oldest grandchild, the only one who used to visit without being asked.
the only one who once spent an entire afternoon building a birdhouse with me, then painted it bright red and said, "This will be the coolest place in the whole yard." The letter was short, just a few lines. "Dad and Lisa are freaking out. They said you disappeared. No one's heard from you. I've been checking every day. I miss you. Please let me know you're okay." There was a phone number scribbled at the bottom, his new one. I sat with the letter in my lap, reading it over and over. This was different from the frantic, self-serving concern I imagined coming from Adam and Lisa. This felt real. This was from the boy who remembered me as a person, not just a function. He was my unexpected ally, a voice of genuine care in a wilderness of neglect. His letter was a test of my newfound resolve. A part of me, the old me, wanted to call him immediately, to soothe his worry, to reassure him. But the woman who had bought a one-way ticket to Portland knew better. It wasn't punishment. I wasn't cruel. I just wasn't ready to open the door they had all closed without blinking. It takes much longer to walk back from that kind of silence than it does to fall into it. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the drawer of my nightstand. It was a fragile link to a past I was not yet ready to engage with, but one I wasn't willing to sever completely. Not yet.
At the cafe, Heather would say, "You've got a visitor," and I'd turn to see a man in a gray windbreaker standing just inside the door. He looked to be in his early 80s, neatly dressed, clean-shaven, a little unsteady on his feet. The first day he came in, he peered at the menu like it was written in another language. When he spotted me, he smiled. "You the one who knows how to make real coffee?" he asked. I poured him a cup and set it down. "Cream and sugar?" "Just cream, 2 splashes." He came back the next day, and the day after that. By Thursday, I learned his name was Arthur. He was a widower with 2 sons, one in Boston and one in Arizona, both too busy to visit often. We didn't talk about them much. Mostly we discussed birds. He liked cardinals, and I liked finches. We both agreed that crows were smarter than people gave them credit for. Our conversations were simple, built on shared observations rather than shared histories. It was a relief. With Arthur, there was no past to excavate, no wounds to navigate. There was just the present moment, a cup of coffee, and a mutual respect for the quiet rhythms of a long life. He never pried. He didn't ask why I was there, or where I had come from. He seemed to understand that some stories are not meant to be told until they have settled. He offered presence, not pity. One Friday, he brought in a small framed picture of his wife. "Married 46 years, he said, his voice soft. "She made better coffee than this, but you come close." I smiled and refilled his cup. It wasn't a sad gesture. It was an offering of trust, a small window into a life lived with a love that was real and enduring. His quiet companionship stood in stark contrast to the transactional dynamics of my own family. With Arthur, there were no obligations, no unwritten rules, only the easy comfort of 2 people who had seen enough of the world to appreciate a simple, honest connection. That evening, I stood by my window, watching the wind stir the leaves outside. I thought of Arthur's hands wrapped around the warm mug, of Kieran's letter tucked safely in my drawer, of the navy coat hanging on the back of my door. There were still gaps in this new life, still quiet aches in the middle of the night, but for the first time, I felt that something new was taking shape. Not a return to what I had lost, but a turning towards something I hadn't known I could find. It had been 3 weeks since the airport, 3 weeks since the lounge chair with the broken armrest, since the cheap plastic water bottle Adam had pressed into my hand before disappearing. One night, armed with a quiet resolve I didn't know I possessed, I took the phone from its hiding place in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. I turned it on. It buzzed like a dying insect, a frantic vibration against the worn wood. 32 missed calls, 18 voicemails. The screen was a catalog of manufactured panic. I listened to them methodically, one by one. The oldest was from Lisa, a high-pitched, frantic message left on the day of their flight. "Martha, we thought you were in the bathroom. Please call us. We're boarding now."
It was a clumsy, transparent lie. The rest were more of the same. Adam's voice, curt and tight with irritation, not worry. "Where are you, Mom?" Then, "This isn't funny anymore." And finally, the anger giving way to dismissive arrogance. "Fine, do what you want." Not a single message asked if I was okay. They only asked where I was, as if I were a misplaced set of keys. Their concern wasn't for my well-being, but for the disruption of their plans, for their loss of control. I deleted them all without a second thought. Then, the phone rang in my hand. It was an unfamiliar number, but I had a feeling I knew who it was. I answered. "Grandma?" His voice cracked, uncertain. It was Kieran. "I'm here, darling," I said, my own voice softer than I expected.
There was a long pause, filled with the sound of his sharp intake of breath. "You're okay." It wasn't a question. It was a prayer answered. "I'm better than okay, Kieran." "Where are you?" "Somewhere quiet," I said. "Somewhere I chose." He didn't beg me to come home. He didn't try to guilt me. He just said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm glad you're safe. I miss you." "I miss you too, sweetheart." That was all. No explanations, no apologies, just the clean, simple sound of someone who still wanted me in their life. Not because I made birthday cakes or babysat on weekends, but because I, Martha, mattered. And that sound, so soft and sincere, meant more than any first-class seat on a plane to paradise. It was enough to fortify me for whatever was to come next. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a letter arrived. Joyce slid it across the kitchen table without comment. The return address was Wilmington, my old home. The handwriting was familiar in the way a bruise is familiar, something you recognize by the ache it leaves behind. It was from Adam. The envelope was thick. Inside were 6 pages of neat, angry script. There was no greeting, just, "I can't believe you did this." He accused me of disappearing, of making a scene with my absence, of putting the family through unimaginable stress during their vacation. "Lisa cried every night," he wrote. "The kids were confused. Do you have any idea how unfair that was to them?" Not a single word about the airport lounge. Not a word about asking me to wait for 8 hours. The letter was a masterclass in rewriting history, meticulously erasing his own actions and centering their manufactured pain. He was narrating a version of the truth they had been building behind my back for years. The letter ended with the ultimate power play, an ultimatum dressed as an olive branch. "We're willing to talk, but only if you're ready to be reasonable." Reasonable? The word hung in the air, a final, stunning insult. As if my decades of babysitting, cooking, paying their bills, and being told where to sit and when to be quiet had been unreasonable. As if my one act of self-preservation was a childish tantrum, not a calculated choice made by a woman who had finally been pushed too far. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. That night, after Joyce had gone to bed, I took the letter from my drawer. I stood over the kitchen sink, lit a match, and fed the pages to the flame, one by one. I watched my son's angry, self-serving words turn to black, curling ash. It wasn't a dramatic act. It was quiet, final, and deeply satisfying. As the last corner of the last page disappeared, Joyce appeared in the doorway. She didn't flinch. "I would have used the fire pit," she said, her voice gravelly in the dark. Then she turned and went back to bed. In that moment, I knew I was truly home. The first sign they were escalating their campaign came on a Saturday. As I was wiping down the corner booth at the cafe, I caught sight of a face at the window. It was Lisa. Her coat was too nice for the Portland drizzle, her expression unreadable. She stood there for only a second, a ghost from a life I no longer lived, then turned and walked away. She didn't come in. It wasn't a visit. It was a scouting mission. The real attack arrived a few days later. An envelope from Wilmington, this time a bulky manila folder. Joyce handed it to me with her eyebrows raised. "You got fans now," she grunted.
Inside was a printout of a newspaper article, folded in thirds. It was from the front page of the community section of our old hometown paper. The headline read, "Missing Matriarch. Family Speaks Out on Grandmother's Disappearance." There was a photo of me from some family gathering years ago, holding a pie dish, smiling a tight, polite smile.
The article quoted Adam extensively. "We're deeply worried," he said. "She vanished without a word. We just want her home safe." Lisa had a quote too. "She's vulnerable. We fear something terrible has happened. She's not the type to do something like this." I laughed out loud, a sharp, startled sound that made even me jump. Not the type, as if they knew what type I was. Joyce leaned over my shoulder and read a few lines. "They really said vulnerable?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. I nodded. "You should sue them for underestimating you," she said. I smiled. "They'll have to stand in line." It was a masterfully cruel piece of public theater, a calculated effort to infantilize me, to frame my deliberate escape as a confused wandering, thereby erasing their own culpability. This public humiliation was a classic tactic designed to shame me back into my docile, dependent matriarch. But they had miscalculated. For me, the article wasn't a source of shame. It was proof. The final, irrefutable proof that people only start worrying about you when they can no longer use you. They weren't looking for Martha. They were looking for their unpaid nanny, their emergency bank account, their compliant, invisible mother. But that woman was gone. She had been left behind in an airport lounge, and she wasn't coming back. The next morning, a man in an expensive suit stood outside the cafe. He waited until my shift ended, then stepped inside as I was wiping down the last table. He removed his sunglasses and gave me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Are you Mrs. Martha Harlow?" he asked. His tone was too formal, too careful. "I am," I said, not returning the smile. "My name is Derek Sorensen. I represent Adam and Lisa Harlow. They've asked me to speak with you regarding your well-being and your assets." Assets. There it was, the heart of the matter. The game had finally been revealed. Their worry wasn't for my safety, it was for their inheritance. They weren't hunting for a lost mother, they were tracking a financial liability. I felt a cold, clear anger settle inside me. "My well-being is excellent," I said, my voice steady, "and my assets are none of your business." He shifted uncomfortably, the professional smile faltering. "They're very concerned, Mrs. Harlow. They'd like to ensure you're in a safe environment, perhaps discuss some next steps." I folded my apron and placed it on the counter. The old Martha would have been intimidated by his suit, his title, his condescending tone, but the new Martha was unimpressed. "Tell Adam and Lisa that I am not a pet they forgot to pick up from the kennel," I said, my voice low and sharp. "And there are no next steps, unless I am the one taking them." He cleared his throat. "If you just consider—" "I've considered enough for one lifetime." I walked past him and out the door, leaving him blinking in the sudden daylight. I didn't look back. I was no longer a passive object to be managed. I was a sovereign entity, and I understood the rules of this game far better than they did. The velvet glove was off, and I was ready for what came next. That evening, I sat at the small desk in my room and wrote 2 letters. The confrontation with the lawyer, Derek Sorensen, had been the final catalyst. I was no longer just reacting, I was taking control of the narrative. The first letter was to Lisa. I used a simple, plain note card. My handwriting was steady. "Lisa," I wrote, "I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I am not angry, and I am not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I have finally started mine." It wasn't an attack. It wasn't about revenge. It was a statement of fact, a quiet declaration of freedom. It was the closing of a door that had been left ajar for far too long. The second letter was to Mr. Sorensen. This one I wrote on proper stationery I'd bought at the corner drugstore. It was a masterpiece of calm, assertive power.
To whom it may concern, it began, there is no cause for any further legal contact regarding my affairs. I am of sound mind, residing in a safe environment, and I am not under any form of duress. Please be advised that I have retained local legal counsel. Any further attempts by you or your clients to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment and will be dealt with accordingly. Sincerely, Martha Harlow. I had not, in fact, retained legal counsel yet, but they didn't need to know that. The threat was enough. I was turning their own weapons back on them, using the language of law and order to build a fortress around my new life. The next morning, I walked to the post office. I bought 2 stamps. One had a picture of a lighthouse, sturdy and unyielding. The other had a small bird on it, a finch, the kind that sings even in the cold. I placed the finch on the letter to Lisa, and the lighthouse on the one to her lawyer. As I dropped them into the mailbox, I felt a profound sense of finality. This was the last correspondence, the last bridge burned, and I felt nothing but relief. I expected silence after my letters, or perhaps another, more aggressive volley from Adam's lawyer. What I didn't expect was an envelope with a local postmark addressed to me in care of Joyce. The handwriting was Kieran's. Grandma, it read, I'm coming to Portland. I want to see you. I'm not bringing anyone else. I just want to talk. I'm staying at the Red Fern Motel on Maple, room 12. I'll be there Friday and Saturday. If you want to come by, I will wait. If not, I'll understand. There was no guilt in it, no pressure, just a young man reaching out with quiet, steady hands. This was the only thread to my past I hadn't severed, and now it was extending toward me. On Friday morning, I dressed carefully. Not for him, but for myself. I wore the navy coat, a clean blouse, and lipstick the color of dried cherries. I didn't tell Joyce where I was going. She didn't ask. The Red Fern Motel was modest, clean but tired. I knocked once on the door of room 12. He opened it immediately, as if he'd been waiting with his hand on the knob. He was taller than I remembered, with scruff on his jaw and shadows under his eyes. But he had the same gentle way of looking at me. Hi, Grandma. Hi, sweetheart. He stepped back and let me in. The room smelled of takeout food and hotel soap. The bed was made, but the desk was cluttered with books. He brought books. That said everything. We sat, not too close, leaving space for the unspoken things between us. I didn't know if you'd come, he said. I didn't know either. He nodded. I read your letter, he said quietly. The one you didn't send to Dad. You left it in your nightstand drawer. Mom found it. Of course she did. Lisa never respected a closed door. I'm glad you didn't send it, he said, but I'm more glad you wrote it. We talked for over an hour, about his new job at a bookstore, about how I liked Portland, about how freedom tasted different when no one was watching. He didn't ask if I was coming back. I didn't ask if he was staying. We both knew better. This was a reconciliation on new terms, my terms. Before I left, he handed me a small wrapped bundle. It was a book of poems. I underlined the ones that made me think of you, he said. It was a gift that acknowledged my inner life, a stark contrast to the Vacation Nana t-shirt. It was a gift of being seen. After Kieran left, a new kind of quiet settled over my life. The frantic noise from my old world had faded, replaced by the gentle, steady rhythms of my new one. The threat was gone. The war was over. All that was left was living.
Joyce turned 70 on a Tuesday. I don't want a party, she'd grumbled. People start singing and I get the urge to run. But I baked a chocolate cake anyway and left it on the kitchen table with 2 candles and a card that read, "You're not old, you're vintage." She laughed when she saw it, a deep, rumbling sound. I guess I can tolerate cake, she said, slicing it into thick, generous wedges. That night, we sat on the porch wrapped in old quilts, eating cake from paper plates and watching the moon rise. It was a quiet celebration, the kind I never used to believe in, but the kind that now felt more real than any loud, crowded party ever had. The house on East Stafford was no longer just a refuge. It was home. My friendships with Joyce, Heather, and Arthur were no longer just alliances. They were family, a family chosen and earned. One morning, Heather handed me a new apron she'd found in a clearance bin. It was deep green with stitched lettering that read, "Not your grandma's kitchen." We both laughed, a full, easy sound. Arthur, sitting in his usual booth, raised his coffee mug in a silent salute. These were the moments that made up my new life. They weren't grand gestures or dramatic pronouncements. They were small, tangible acts of kindness and connection. The easy camaraderie at the cafe, the comfortable silences with Arthur, the shared pot of something fragrant on the stove with Joyce. This was my life now. Simple, quiet, free of unnecessary people and unnecessary emotions. The silence that had once felt like something missing now felt like peace, permanent, final. It was the sound of a life that was finally, completely my own. That night, back in my small, quiet room, I sat on the porch with a pen and a blank card. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. I wasn't writing to Adam or Lisa or even Kieran. I was writing to myself. "Dear me," I wrote, "you waited so long for someone else to save you. You spent decades hoping someone would see your worth, that they would finally acknowledge the love you gave so freely. You forgot you were always the one holding the key." I paused, looking out at the dark street. The words felt true, solid. I continued. "You didn't lose them. They let you go. And you finally let go back. And look at the life that opened up when you did. Well done. Love, me." I taped the note to the inside of my dresser drawer, behind the old recipe cards, a private reminder just in case I ever started to forget again. So, that's my story. I wasn't abandoned. I was released. I didn't rebuild my old life. I built something entirely new, from the ground up, on a foundation of self-respect. It wasn't the ending I ever would have expected for myself. It was better, harder, clearer, more honest. It was mine. If this story found you at the right moment, don't wait for the perfect sign to choose yourself. Be your own sign. Be your own noise in the silence. Be your own one-way ticket away from the airport lounge. And when you do, come back and tell me your story. I'll be here, and I'll be listening. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share what you would have done in my place. Your voice matters. Thank you for joining us for another story here on When the Mother Awakens. Martha's journey is a powerful reminder that it's never too late to reclaim your own life, to find your strength not in fire, but in the quiet act of forgetting those who told you that you couldn't. What would you have done in her place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice and your story matter to this community. And if you were moved by this story, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to When the Mother Awakens and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. We'll be waiting for you.